just really happy that you're here, Kevin.
Glad
Kevin
to be here.
McLaughlin is the George Hazard Crooker Professor of English and Comparative Literature and German Studies at Brown University. Kevin has done a number of things with us. Oh, he's also, I wanted to mention the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study at Brown, which is a new institution, and I think very much he's played a very important role in that in the development of that, following his very devoted work to the humanities over many years at Brown. So it's it's really quite a set of accomplishments there. In his writings, we have been able to host him a couple of times now, so maybe it's three. But Kevin will be familiar to the EGS audience. But I'll just remind you that he published not long ago, and we discussed the philology of life, Walter Benjamin's critical program. He's a co-translator with Howard Island of the Arcades Project, again in Benjamin. And he is recently finished as co-translator and co-editor with Susan Bernstein and Peter Fenves of Benjamin's writings on Goethe. His current topic, the next book in that series, which I'm very eager to see, and I think it's very important that it will be a critical edition of the a Task of the Translator, as I understand. That should be really very important. His current presentation is entitled "Disappearing Tales: Walter Benjamin and the Novel." And I expected to learn a lot of new things about Benjamin once again. So, Kevin, thank you very, very much for joining us. And I pass the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. First, a couple of words of thanks. First to Chris for the generous invitation. Also, of course, to Nemanja, who's amazing in helping to support these things. I'm not sure when he sleeps, so whenever I send an email to him at whatever time of day or night, I usually have a response in about 30 seconds. So that's always really nice, and it's usually a cheerful and reassuring response. So thank you, Nemanja. I also wanted to thank, in case there are any students who were in the mini seminar last fall at the EGS, to thank them, because some of what I have to present here today was gestating in relation to preparing for that seminar and teaching it. So I wanted to thank them, and then also wanted to thank Susan Bernstein and Peter Fenves, with whom, as you've just heard, been working on a translation of Benjamin's writings on Goethe, which is coming out next month from Stanford University Press, simply called Walter Benjamin on Goethe. We have not yet, as a minor correction, we have not yet, among Susan, Peter, and I, agreed that we will work on an edition of the English translation and critical edition of the Task of the Translator. I think I mentioned that to Chris at some point. I hope that if we don't, that someone does at some point. I think it would be a great project, but so far we haven't actually committed to it. So I just wanted to make that.
Forgive me for that.
No problem. It may turn out that it was true what you said.
Good.
We'll see. So I'm gonna jump right in. Walter Benjamin offers some intriguing reflections on popularization in a pair of short articles written in the 1930s in connection with his radio experiments. There are, he argues, two kinds of popularization. One that takes place on the basis of theoretical knowledge developed within a scientific community of specialists and then transmitted in a simplified form to the broader public. And another that occurs when knowledge develops out of the movement both of the specialists and of the broader public towards one another. In the second case, Benjamin writes, quote, "We are dealing with a popularity that sets in motion not only knowledge in the direction of the public, but at the same time, the public in the direction of knowledge," close quote. The point at which such popularized knowledge emerges is, Benjamin insists, unfamiliar to both the specialists and the public. Exemplary of this dynamic kind of popularization, he argues, are the writings of what he calls the great popularizers of modern physics from the mid-1920s, such as Arthur Stanley Eddington and Albert Einstein. These popularizers, he contends, make it possible for the non-specialized public, quote, to take up the standpoint on which the avant-garde of today's science stands, close quote. Benjamin works out such a standpoint with regard to the novel in his essay on Goethe's elective affinities, a work that itself seeks to popularize what Benjamin calls a new approach to the 18th century scientific theory named in its title. If Goethe's novel does not provide its readers with an explicit description of its scientific standpoint, Benjamin's essay on Goethe also does not offer an overt explanation of its literary critical standpoint on the novel as a genre. In neither case can one speak with certainty of a successful popularization, what Benjamin characterizes as, quote, bringing the non-specialist reader into the game and giving him the certainty that he is being propelled forward, close quote. Whether the game in question is early 19th century natural science or early 20th century literary criticism on the novel. The real obstacle, as Benjamin calls it, to popularization is what he describes as, quote, the absence of a historical constellation, close quote. The question of such a constellation with regard to the legacy of Goethe, in particular, Goethean science, as aligned with the revolutionary developments in quantum physics a century later, according to Benjamin, became a central problem for Benjamin in the early 1920s, and indeed for the rest of his career. The traces of his attempt to popularize a corresponding standpoint on the novel can be found in the literary journals and magazines to which Benjamin turned as what we would call a public intellectual during this period, leading up in particular to the now popular 1936 essay, The Storyteller, Der Erzähler. Benjamin's development of a theory of the novel as it extends from his early study of Goethe to his late essay, The Storyteller, exemplifies the dynamic action analyzed in his remarks on popularization, while pointing to its operation in the novel From Goethe to Proust. In what follows here today, I propose to lay out this thesis in a set of 4 reflections that moves between Benjamin and Proust. The first one is on Benjamin's theory of the novel. As Georg Lukács was composing the theory of the novel in Heidelberg in 1914 and 1915, Walter Benjamin was in Berlin writing an essay on the poetry of Friedrich Hölderlin. There is no indication that Benjamin read Lukács' work when it first appeared in the Zeitschrift für Ästhetik und Allgemeine Kunstwissenschaft the following year, in 1916. Benjamin did, however, read a book published that year by a renowned professor in Heidelberg with connections to Lukács. And this reading led Benjamin to develop an approach to the novel that guided the critical commentary he started to write a few years later on a particular novel, namely Goethe's Elective Affinities, and that informed his reflections on the novel in general in the 1936 essay, The Storyteller. The book in question bore the title simply of Goethe, and the renowned Heidelberg professor was Friedrich Gundolf. Benjamin returned to Gundolf's Goethe during a stay in Heidelberg himself in the late summer and fall of 1921, as he began writing his essay on elective affinities. A reworked version of his critique of Gundolf was inserted into the second part of the completed essay. And it was precisely at this time that Benjamin read The Theory of the Novel, between its publication as a book in 1920 and in August of 1921. Yet Benjamin makes no mention of the theory of the novel in his essay on elective affinities. In spite of the decision to read, or less likely the coincidence of reading, the theory of the novel as he began working on Goethe's novel, and in spite of the many connections and parallels between the two critics, both of whom ultimately failed to secure permanent academic positions at this time, Lukács and Benjamin were on different tracks when it came to the novel. The approach Benjamin took in his essay, Goethe's Elective Affinities, derived in part from his critique of Gundolf, who was, like Lukács, within the Weber circle during the years in question. Indeed, Gundolf stood within a space of overlap between the Weber circle on the one hand and another influential Heidelberg circle at this time, that of Stefan George, on the other. It was Gundolf, in fact, who introduced Weber to George. Benjamin may have been surprised to find Gundolf in 1921 with recognized standing in both of the most influential intellectual circles in Heidelberg, in effect occupying a space where social science and literature were somehow mingling at that time. Benjamin's critical remarks on Gundolf a few years earlier locate the latter unambiguously within the George circle, and this is made explicit in the reworking of the remarks in the essay on elective affinities. Lukács, for his part, was clearly positioned within the Weber circle, even as he maintained good relations with Gundolf, a member indeed of George's inner circle. These overlapping intellectual circles in the Heidelberg of this period, leading up to and during the First World War, present a version of the fundamental question to which Weber himself had been responding, most prominently in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the question, namely, of the relation of social conditions to the cultural sphere, or in the Marxian terms that Weber was trying to revise, of the material base to the superstructure. And indeed, Weber formulated his response to the question from the perspective of social science by drawing on the term from Goethe's novel that was itself borrowed from the natural science of its time, specifically that of elective affinities, as Benjamin must have noticed when he read the following sentence in the slightly revised version of Weber's work that appeared in 1920. This is the first slide there. In view of the prodigious, this is Weber. In view of the prodigious confusion of interdependent influences between the material basis, the forms of social and political organization, and the spiritual subject matter of the Reformation's cultural epics, it is only possible to proceed at first with an investigation as to whether and at what points specific elective affinities, quotation marks, between certain forms of religious belief and vocation determinative ethics are recognizable. It's Weber. With this, Benjamin's critique of Weber, the traces of which can be found in the notes taken down earlier in 1921 under the title of Capitalism as Religion, intersects with the reflections on Goethe that got underway in his remarks on Gundolf's book a few years earlier. Benjamin begins his critique of Gundolf by calling into question the latter's mishandling of the distinction between the works of Goethe on the one hand and the correspondence and conversations on the other. This, coincidentally, is also a matter of circles, in this case, the concentric life circles to which Gundolf consigns respectively the works, the correspondence, and the conversations of Goethe. Benjamin remarks are worth quoting at length, and this is the next slide. This is rather a long quote. So if, Nemanja, if you could advance to number 2. Thank you. It's a little small, but I hope you can read it. Okay, so this is Benjamin's critique of Gundolf, preserved in a letter that was written to Gershom Scholem, actually. At the beginning of Gundolf's book, Benjamin writes, there is to be found the distinction among 3 concentric life circles of a creative person, and in particular Goethe. These are work, letter, conversation. He makes the work the central circle to which one in essence must refer. He guards himself against any other testimonials and sources that might significantly contribute to the evaluation of Goethe's essence. The objective mendacity of the said separation rests on the following. Its analogy is useful and required in the large historical presentation, where it presents a methodical and source-critical point of view as a separation between what has been written and what has been passed on orally, and enables different scales of transition between written and oral tradition. Above all, this true analog of the false Gundolfian distinction is important where there exists the most essential difference between two kinds of tradition, namely in the religious and mythic region of history, where the balancing and struggle between the two regulates humanity's relationship to its ultimate foundation, revelation. The difference, wherever it is legitimate, may never be conceived by the historian as a difference of value, only as a difference of meaning. In Gundolf's case, this is reversed. The two peripheral circles are considered to have almost negative value for historical presentation. They have, for him, no deeper difference of meaning. In fact, their only legitimate objective basis, the divorce between speech and writing, is not present at all. This means all conceivable oral tradition, letter, conversation, etc., concerning Goethe would have to be essentially transformed into a written tradition, and the entire influx of oral speech and what's more, of private life into writing creates a completely different concept of the written word than the mythical religious concept. And the work, to be sure, also belongs within the scope of this new concept, but it does not belong within the mendacious exclusivity and monumentality in which Gundolf seeks to present it. Benjamin on Gundolf. Thus, Benjamin argues, by erroneously eliminating the correspondence and conversations as legitimate sources of insight into what Benjamin calls Goethe's essence, Gundolf simplistically makes the difference between the two modes of transmission or tradition the basis for a positive and negative value judgment on the materials in question. Quote, the difference, wherever it is legitimate, Benjamin writes, must never be conceived by the historian as a difference of value, only as one of meaning, Bedeutung. In Gundolf's case, this is reversed, close quote. On the basis of this reversal, Gundolf makes Goethe into an image of a certain vision of history, one that is underwritten by religion and myth, a progressive, or what Benjamin also calls a pragmatic history, based on the poet as hero and the work as his mythic task. Then, according to Benjamin, Gundolf applies this false methodological idea to the poet as its, quote, empirical embodiment. Thus, it is an error to begin with what Benjamin calls the false principle of a template-like image of the poet's life, it is equally misguided to commence with the elevation of the works over the other archival materials for insight into the poet's essence. The positive alternative to the latter approach, to the approach of Gundolf, rejects the mythical religious monumentalization of Goethe's works and its underlying valorization of, quote, what has been written over, quote, what has been passed on orally. For it is precisely the influx of orality into writing, Benjamin insists, that creates a concept of writing removed from the sphere of myth and religion. A writing from which myth and religion are removed turns into a medium in which stories or tales, mythoi, are not simply eliminated, but rather disappear. To the extent that it is associated with writing in this sense, the novel may be understood not only as the literal medium of this disappearance, but also as its thematization. The novel thus becomes the genre of disappearing tales, rather than the epic of transcendental homelessness, as Lukács would have it. This ambiguity informs the key role played by the standpoint of the narrator, here the Erzähler, which is, of course, is the word that's translated as storyteller in Benjamin's essay on the storyteller, in Goethe's Elective Affinities, according to Benjamin. And it is this standpoint of the narrator that marks the situation of the novel that is presented in the later essay, The Storyteller, which could also be translated as the narrator, and in a manner that silently extends the approach taken to Goethe's novel. And it is precisely at the crucial end of Benjamin's 1936 essay that Lukács's theory of the novel is explicitly cited, specifically its claim that what Lukács calls the meaning of life is the center around which the novel moves. But Benjamin's response to this question differs significantly from that of Lukács, as is clearly indicated in the allusion to the, quote, written life, Benjamin writes, confronting the novel reader, and the passage from Flaubert's Éducation sentimentale that is presented aptly without explanation as its ultimate example. This is the third slide. This is Benjamin quoting from Flaubert, or commenting and then quoting. Frédéric et Deslauriers, boyhood friends, think back to the days of their youth when the following incident occurred. One day they showed up at the bordello in their hometown, stealthily and timidly, to do nothing more in the end than present the patron with a bouquet of flowers which they had picked in their own gardens. Quote from Flaubert, there was still talk of this 3 years later, and now they told, Benjamin translates the French here as erzählte, using the word that is cognate with erzähler, or as narrator, and now they told it to each other in detail, each completing the recollection of the other. That may have been, said Frédéric, when they had finished, the most beautiful thing in our life. Das Schönste in unserem Leben, Benjamin translates from the French. Yes, you may be right, said Deslauriers. That was perhaps the most beautiful thing in our life. With such a cognition, the work, this is Benjamin writing in his own voice, with such a cognition, the work reaches an end which is more proper to the novel in a stricter sense than to any story. Flaubert's novel ends with storytelling, in other words, with a scene of the reciprocal telling of a story, and specifically with its disappearance. Instead of being told viva voce by Frédéric et Deslauriers together in direct quotation, the tale is buried in the free indirect style of the novel's narrative discourse. Not just buried, but reburied in the sense that the elided conversation is described as, quote, from Flaubert, exhuming their youth, close quote, in the form of a story that was remembered but not recounted 3 years later in a passage from the beginning of the novel. Benjamin translates the phrase repeated at the end of the novel as, that was perhaps the most beautiful thing in our life. I'm translating it into English, Benjamin's German translation of the French, the German here, das war vielleicht das Schönste in unserem Leben, Benjamin translates. The French text reads, translated into English, that is the best we have had. The French here is, c'est là ce que nous avons eu de meilleur. The German translation and addition, together with the allusion to cognition which follows, emerging in the repeated phrase, transpose the end of Flaubert's novel into the terms of Benjamin's earlier approach to Goethe's elective affinities, and in particular to the figure of Ottilia in that work. Sentimental education ends, Benjamin suggests, with what he calls in the study of Goethe, the expiring semblance of Ottilia, could be called here the expiring semblance of storytelling that is underway at the beginning of the novel when there was still talk of the story, but no recounting of it until now, at the end of the novel, when its recounting is conveyed only indirectly. Quote, and now they told the story, und nun erzählten sie, etc. Thus, from Goethe to Flaubert, according to Benjamin, the novel presents what he calls a new beauty in what is disappearing. That's the first section on the novel. Second section is on Proust and Flaubert. The year before Benjamin turned to his critical commentary on Goethe's novel, a controversy erupted in France over the work of one of its most important 19th century novelists, namely Flaubert. Into this critical altercation leapt Marcel Proust with an article published in La Nouvelle Revue Française in January 1920. Proust's essay was framed as a response to an article by Albert Thibaudet that had appeared 2 months earlier in the same magazine, and that was part of a wider conflict over Flaubert in French literary reviews during 1919. Proust's response, however, was based on notes that went back to 1908, as work on his novel was getting underway, beginning in 1907. In the course of formulating his approach to what would become In Search of Lost Time, Proust came to admire precisely those discursive features of Flaubert's novels that Thibaudet and the others a decade later regarded merely as grammatical errors. The first of these was the use of a technique that was also in the process of being classified by the linguistic specialists during these years as the legitimate grammatical category of the free indirect style, style indirect libre, the presentation of the words or thoughts of a third person without the use of a subordinate conjunction. The case for the grammatical legitimacy of the free indirect style was made to the specialists in a 1912 article in the Germanisch-Romanische Monatsschrift by Charles Bailly. Ferdinand de Saussure's successor as chair of General and Comparative Linguistics at the University of Geneva and co-editor of his course in General Linguistics that was published in 1916 on the basis of lectures delivered between 1906 and 1911. Bailly contradicted the German Romance philologist Fritz Strohmeyer, who had claimed a few years earlier in his book that from 1910, that by way of contrast with German, the indirect style in French requires the use of a subordinate conjunction. Here is Bailly's thesis, and this is the third one. You've got it up there. Thank you, Rumania. This affirmation by Strohmeyer is inexact in its generality. French knows of a free indirect style without a conjunction analogous to that of German. Only the grammarians are unaware of it almost entirely because they base themselves ordinarily on classical language, in which this free form remains an exception, whereas it is developed largely in the literary language of the past 100 years. Taken together, the practically simultaneous responses of Bailly and Proust to the controversies over free indirect style among the linguistic specialists on the one hand, and the French literary public on the other, work to instigate the double movement of what Benjamin describes as the second, more complex kind of popularization in the essay discussed at the beginning of this talk, one that comes about through the convergence of the specialists and the non-specialists around a point that is unfamiliar to both. Bailly is directing the specialists to move beyond their static base of what he calls classical language toward, quote, the literary language of the past 100 years, where the free form of indirect discourse, he claims, had been largely developed. At the same time, Proust is urging the French reading public to embrace the vision that informs Flaubert's use of this linguistic technique and to reject the rigid perspective of influential non-specialists from which it appears as nothing more than a grammatical error. Thus, through the interventions of Bailly and Proust, the free indirect style during these years can be seen entering into a popularization process that, to paraphrase Benjamin, sets in motion not only knowledge in the direction of the public, but also the public in the direction of knowledge. Moreover, as Bailly and Proust both make clear in their respective contexts, the question of the free form of indirect discourse is a matter of great consequence since it concerns the scientific legitimation and the public acceptance, not simply of an isolated linguistic technique, but rather of a vision and knowledge of the world. This is the point that Bailly makes in the striking open-ended remark with which his article concludes. Quote from Bailly, "The indirect style is not a grammatical form. It is a mental attitude or spiritual attitude de l'esprit, an aspect and a particular angle from which the mind or spirit perceives things." Close quote. This is certainly the way Proust sees the matter as well when it comes to Flaubert's style. Citing the novel that was published in the very middle of the period to which Bailly alludes, Proust insists that the free indirect style reports, quote, not only the words, but the entire life of people. And this is my fifth slide. Again, a little bit long, I apologize. This eternal imperfect, one will allow me to qualify an indefinite past as eternal. Therefore, this eternal imperfect, partly composed of the words of the characters that Flaubert usually reports in indirect style so that they merge with the rest. And then he quotes from Éducation sentimentale. The state was to take over the stock exchange. Many other measures were also good. It was first necessary to pass the level over the heads of the rich. The nurses and the midwives had to be paid by the state. 10,000 citizens with good guns could make the Hotel de Ville tremble, close quote. All this, Proust goes on, does not mean that Flaubert thinks and affirms this, but that Frédéric Vatnaz or Sénécal say so, and that Flaubert has resolved to use as few quotation marks as possible. Therefore, the imperfect, so new in literature, changes entirely the aspect of things and beings. Like a lamp that has been moved, the arrival in a new house, the old one if it is almost empty, and that we are in the midst of moving. It is this kind of sadness made by the disruption of habits and the unreality of the decor that Flaubert's style gives. This style so new when it would only be that way. This imperfect serves to report not only the words, but the entire life of people. Sentimental education is a long report of an entire life without the characters taking, so to speak, an active part in the action. Remarkable observation. The free indirect style, according to Proust, changes entirely the aspect of things and beings. It is a matter of reporting not only the words, but an entire life of people. It is the report of a life involving an action that specifically goes beyond and transcends the sphere in which subjects, or in this case, characters, are understood to take an active part. It is thus not the life of a people in the sense of a mythic subject conveyed by the loaded French word peuple, nor is it the life of a population in the sense of a social scientific object that this word had acquired in the 19th century. The life reported is neither the subject of myth nor the object of biopolitical discipline. It is rather a life of people, une vie des gens, a life whose style is indirect, is indeed free, a life whose style is indeed free precisely to the extent that it lacks the direction of a grand historical narrative, either of heroic achievement or of statistical objectification, much less of individual developments. Life as it is freed in this specific sense is what appears from the standpoint that Proust is trying to popularize in his note on Flaubert's style in La Nouvelle Revue Française in January 1920. Proust describes plans at this time to make his remarks on Flaubert into the starting point for a whole series of literary critical essays addressed to the French reading public to redress what he characterized as, quote, the defective manner that we have of judging great writers, close quote. That's a letter from Proust of November 13th, 1919. Presumably, this correction would have involved moving readers to take up the standpoint in forming his essay on Flaubert. This literary critical series was left unwritten when Proust died in 1922. Yet his great novel that had started appearing in 1913 and that continued to appear after his death may be understood to have had the very same goal. In other words, a goal to popularize a standpoint, an avant-garde standpoint. This is the third section, and it's on Benjamin on Proust. The singular perspective informing Proust's great novel was the subject of an essay published by Benjamin in Die Literarische Welt in 1929, 7 years after completing his study of Goethe's elective affinities and 7 years before composing his popular essay, The Storyteller. Benjamin's reflections on In Search of Lost Time, which form a key link between the earlier and the later essays with regard to his approach to the novel, were offered from the standpoint of a professional critic introducing the German reading public to the most advanced literary developments in France. What does Benjamin tell this public? He starts by saying that the 13 volumes of In Search of Lost Time are to be understood as what he calls the result of a synthesis, drawing significantly on a term from Goethe's scientific writings, namely synthesis, that this synthesis gives the 13-volume text a certain unity, and that this unity is what Benjamin calls the actus purus of recollection. Quote, not the person of the author, much less the plot. The recollection in question, Benjamin suggests, is revolutionary, specifically with regard to life. The definitive feature of the life of this work, what Benjamin calls the life work, yoking the first and the second halves of the essay's opening paragraph, is not life as it was, not even the remembering of that life, but life as it is woven by a mode of recollection, Erinnerung, that he calls remembrance, Eingedenken. This is slide 6. Thank you. For the recollecting author, not at all what he lived through, but rather the weaving of his recollection, the Penelope work of remembrance plays the leading role. Or should one speak rather of a Penelope work of forgetting? Is not involuntary remembrance, Proust's Mémoire involontaire, much closer to forgetting than what is usually called recollection? And is this work of spontaneous remembrance, in which recollection is the woof and forgetting the warp, not much more a counterpart to the work of Penelope than its likeness? For here the day unravels what the night wove. Involuntary remembrance is closer to forgetting, not so much because it depends upon something that has been forgotten, but because it reverses the action of what is usually called remembering, namely the deliberate effort to bring the past into the present. Involuntary remembrance is a matter more of the actuality of remembering than of the potentiality of something memorable. Benjamin thus uses the scholastic term actus purus to emphasize the pure actuality of this mode of recollection. It is an actuality that he tries to capture with the term now time, for example, in his later historical philosophical theses. The allusion to Penelope's weaving in this passage is highly significant, in particular the specification that involuntary remembrance in Proust's novel is more of a counterpart to this work than its likeness. If Penelope's weaving serves to support Odysseus's successful return to Ithaca, providing the hero with the time to complete the epic action, the mythos of her weaving serves the master mythos of the Odyssey as an epic poem. The weaving and its presentation in the poem are appropriated by the action and the narrative of Odysseus's reappropriation of the household to which he has become a stranger. Penelope's weaving is in this way woven into the fabric of the Odyssey. The weaving of involuntary remembrance, by contrast, refuses to be appropriated by the life or the narrative of a heroic individual. It is, Benjamin insists, in the service neither of the person of the author nor of the plot. Contrary to the Penelope work that is integrated into the Odyssey, the life work of Mémoire involontaire is precisely what Benjamin in the first sentence of his essay calls an autobiographical work, an act of life writing itself. The shroud of Laertes, completed by Penelope upon the return of Odysseus, his son, becomes the textual image of the restoration of the patriarchal line. In a figure that synthesizes the diurnal nocturnal action of Penelope's production, Amphimedon compares her finished work to, quote, the sun and the moon, and that's from Odyssey 24, 148. As a counterpart to this shining, if somewhat ambiguous image of the triumph of light, the textual production of involuntary remembrance takes place under conditions comparable to a solar eclipse. This is why, Benjamin concludes, quote, Proust finally turned his days into nights, devoting all of his hours to undisturbed work in his darkened room with an artificial illumination so that none of those intricate arabesques might escape him. And this is the last shorter section of the paper. And it's about Proust as a popularizer. It's just some suggestions. I won't be able to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to leave you with some thoughts. Through this allusion to the familiar mutos of Penelope's weaving in the Odyssey and the explanation of how Proust's text reverses its action, Benjamin tries to make it possible for the German reading public to adopt the standpoint from which In Search of Lost Time is composed, namely from the perspective of a mode of recollection that is unfamiliar to these non-specialists. At the same time, the question of the extent to which this standpoint may also be unfamiliar to the specialists is raised by the work of one of the most accomplished contemporary Proust specialists, Antoine Compagnon. In the preface to the excellent recent critical edition overseen by Compagnon and published under the carefully chosen title of Essay, in the authoritative Pléiade collection, Compagnon traces the origin of what became In Search of Lost Time to a period during which the novelist suspended his, quote, copious production, as Compagnon calls it, in the serial press up to that time. This hiatus begins in 1909 and extends to 1920 when the essay analyzed above on Flaubert's style was published in the Nouvelle Revue Française. Quote from Compagnon in the preface to his edition of essays: Proust published nothing or almost nothing in the newspapers or the reviews during the space of time dedicated to the writing of his monumental work. Continuing from Compagnon, this long renunciation on publication in the press and reviews lasted a decade. That it lasted a decade suggests that the drive of the essayist, chronicler of society, philosopher of the arts, that Proust had always been up to that point, had found other outlets than that of articles, namely the novel in progress. Quote from Compagnon. Compagnon's positing of a single drive as the source common to Proust's writings in the press on the one hand, and his novel on the other, raises the question of the extent to which these different outlets, as Compagnon calls them, might also be understood to have the same goal, namely the popularization of an avant-garde standpoint from which knowledge of the past is the product of something other than the deliberate and conscious effort to reconstruct and remember it. Compagnon locates the beginnings of this alternative, what he calls, quote, the embryo of the final novel, its theoretical platform, so to speak, in the, quote, notebooks that we have come to designate under the title of Contre Sainte-Beuve, since they were made public by Bernard de Fallois in 1954, the sketches from the end of 1908 and 1909, close quote. These notebooks developed what Compagnon calls, quote, the premeditated theory, close quote, that he argues the author of In Search of Lost Time found missing from the masterpieces of the 19th century. From this point of view, Proust's project might be seen as an example as the first kind of popularization described by Benjamin in the essay discussed above. The volumes of the novel that began appearing in 1913 and then from 1919 to 1927 would be the medium through which is popularized the new kind of knowledge, a premeditated theory worked out in the notebooks of 1908 and 1909 that Compagnon describes as Proust's laboratory. But a more complex picture, one resembling Benjamin's second kind of popularization, starts to come into view in a closer look at this way of seeing things, especially when the position attributed to Proust on what is lacking in 19th century masterpieces is supported by a passage from the novel The Prisoner that reads like a description of the method adopted in the composition of what became In Search of Lost Time. Indeed, the passage in question is not only describes Proust's method as informed by involuntary remembrance, as the extensive genetic analysis of the text demonstrates, it also exemplifies this mode of composition, which consists in what is characterized in this section of The Prisoner as, quote, a retrospective illumination, close quote, resulting in a unity that is, quote, from Proust, unknown and therefore vital and not logical, close quote. From the standpoint that Proust is trying to popularize, the material collected as what the Pléiade editors call the dossier du contre Sainte-Beuve, and the way that it is woven into the novel does not represent the deliberate overcoming of a flaw, a historical advance over what Compagnon describes as, quote, the insufficiency of 19th century masterpieces, close quote. It is not a correction on the part of a writer whose notorious disinclination to correct was more than merely an editorial matter. Rather, the integration of the earlier sketches into the novel reenacts the retroactive imposition of unity attributed to the 19th century works. This retroactive work is what he attributes to the 19th century, according to the method of involuntary remembrance. This retrospective illumination appears from a standpoint that is unfamiliar to an editorial specialist whose perspective continues to be informed by a certain concept of history and of an attitude toward the past that is the precise target of Proust's entire project. This retrospective view traces a fine line to and from the great works of the 19th century, precisely one that does not follow a progressive path. From the standpoint that Proust is promoting, the incomplete character or the insufficiency of these earlier works is not merely a flaw to be corrected by those that come later. In Search of Lost Time looks back in the same way on the essays later published as Contre Sainte-Beuve in 1954. This is the way of looking at the past that Proust endeavors to popularize in his great novel. Thank you.